The topics and opinions expressed on the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4WN Radio.
This is Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. Do you want to live a more fulfilling life? Do you want to live your legacy and achieve your personal, professional, and financial goals? Well, coming up on Divya Parekh's Beyond Confidence, you will hear real stories of leaders, entrepreneurs, and achievers who have stepped into discomfort, shattered their status quo, and are living the life they want. You will learn how relationships are the key to achieving your aspirations and financial goals. Moving your career or business forward does not have to happen at the expense of your personal or family life, or vice versa. Learn more at www.divyaparekh.com, and you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. This is Beyond Confidence, and now here's your host, Divya Parekh.
Good evening, listeners. So thrilled to be here with you. And I want to share with you, you guys have been so generous in getting my books. So as you can see in the back, both of my books, along with the other books, but these are the two books that are helping entrepreneurs, and profits from these books are going to entrepreneurs impacted by COVID-19. So thank you for your generosity. Really, really appreciate it. And today we have Gregg. So John is a startup and pharmaceutical veteran. He has extensive experience in forming and successfully exiting infectious disease companies. His expertise is in worldwide clinical development and commercialization of microbiological products, new arrivals, and anti-infectives, most recently with an FDA approval in September 2017 of Solosec. He has spent much of his career directing the commercialization efforts for a large number of antibiotics, antiprotozoal, antifungal, antiviral drugs, as well as therapeutics in multiple other areas, including immunology and oncology. He is an industry leader in biotech company development, serving as CEO of specialty infectious disease startup-like company, BalinBac, now focused on developing direct antivirals for COVID-19. So he has also been in large drug companies in leadership roles, including Pfizer, Novartis, Johnson & Johnson, Bristol Myers Squibb, leading planning teams for pipeline compounds. So folks, today what we are going to do is we are going to hear directly from an expert where we are at COVID-19 and what can be expected. So direct information to you. So welcome, John.
Hi. Pleasure to see you.
It's a pleasure to see you as well. So good to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure. Looking forward to a great conversation tonight.
Absolutely. So John, I'm just going to jump straight into the conversation. There are so many misinformations and myths and conspiracies theories out there about COVID-19. So yes, a lot of people have fallen sick, and there are still some people who are thinking COVID-19 may be a myth. What would you have to say to that?
Well, it's not a myth. It's a real virus. It's a zoonotic virus, which means it's jumped from animals to people. And we've been concerned about viruses in this category for a number of years. When I was at Pfizer for about 10 years, we were trying to develop the cure for the common cold, which is also caused by coronaviruses and some related viruses, and had been working on that. The problem we found was one that's similar to what we're having with COVID-19, which is that the best way to stop the replication of viruses is to treat them early with antiviral drugs, almost as soon as the first symptoms appear or you get diagnosed. And that was a challenge then, which is why we don't have the cure for the common cold right now. And it's been a challenge in the development of direct antivirals for this pandemic.
So could you shed some light on, and then why is it a challenge to find therapeutics?
I think one of the challenges that we had in finding therapeutics for COVID-19 to help people who are infected was to have a way of screening existing drugs which could be brought into the clinic very quickly. And we were somewhat unprepared at the beginning of this pandemic. There had been a prior pandemic with a virus called SARS, which is closely related to COVID-19, and then a Middle Eastern respiratory syndrome drug, which was also similar, that came from camels. But the way that we screen for new drugs that would be effective against this particular one was primarily using monkey kidney cells. And if you think about it, the more logical way to screen a drug for a human lung cell infection was to look in human lung cells. And people around the world weren't really prepared to do that at the beginning of this pandemic. And so we made a lot of mistakes based on using monkey kidney cells as a screen rather than human lung cells.
Mm-hmm. No, definitely. That answers the question. We have one of our audience is already asking us questions. So it's a great question. So I would love for you to parse out the theory that, the therapeutics is different from vaccines. So one of the question is, how can anyone okay, let's go to the first question. How possibly could they have a vaccine with not enough drug trials?
Well, with the vaccines, you're trying to give something that will prevent people from having a reaction to the virus later on that'll get you sick. And one of the challenges with this virus is that it does two things. The first thing is that it can directly infect cells, for instance, in the alveoli or some of the cells in the lungs, that can cause damage there, particularly to small blood vessels. But the other thing that it does is it can cause your immune system to massively overreact. And when that happens, you get all sorts of bad outcomes. And the way to treat those are with different types of therapeutics. But for the vaccines, people were trying to come up with ways that you could create an immunological response in your body that would prevent you from ending up having some of these other responses that could get you in the hospital and put you on a respirator and possibly have a bad outcome. The difficulty with the vaccine trials is that they require huge numbers of people. And there are lots and lots of vaccines that are out there now. The ones that we're hearing most about are the ones that have recently been cleared with emergency use authorizations, like the ones from Pfizer and BioNTech and Moderna. Those will be helpful as we get more into the arms of everybody. But the difficulty that we've had, which is why we've lost so many people, is that for the people who get infected with the virus before they get immunized with the vaccines, there's very little for them now. And it turns out that the best thing to do is to get the therapeutics on board and into the patients very quickly. But our infrastructure has not been designed to do that. Pretty much now, the main things that are available require long hospital stays. And so what the government is trying to do is to emphasize development of new therapeutics that you can take very easily and quickly on an outpatient basis. And there you'll have a two-pronged strategy. One is that if you're unlucky enough to get the virus and COVID-19 infection before you're vaccinated, there'll be something for you that can help protect you. And then the longer term strategy is to immunize as many people as possible so that if they get exposed to the virus, it won't really harm them.
Absolutely. Great information, John. So what we are looking over here, folks, I come from pharmaceutical background as well in my previous life. So we're looking at two-pronged approaches. One is immunizing people, and secondly is developing therapeutics as we continue to learn more about the virus and as we continue to develop. And there are some questions that are pouring in, so let's address those before we jump onto therapeutics.
Okay, great.
So another question is, how can anyone be expected to trust getting a vaccine?
Well, I think there were some problems because of some disinformation related to vaccine use and autism. That's been the papers were some bad ones that have later been discredited, but that started a whole movement where people questioned the safety and the effectiveness of vaccines. But if you think about it, a lot of people were getting pediatric vaccines for things like measles, mumps, and rubella, and didn't really have any major concerns with the safety. I think here people are concerned both with more common things like injection site reactions, but also for more, sort of severe allergic responses, which they call hypersensitivity reactions. And there have been a handful reported, but it's extraordinarily rare. And people are going to do a significant amount of vigilance going forward just to ensure that they're all safe. And since we're going to have a number of different vaccine options going forward, perhaps a dozen or more in the future, we'll be able to ensure that if any problems come up with one particular vaccine, that we could switch to another one. But I think it's actually going to be very unlikely that we'll have significant problems with any of them.
Absolutely. And folks, one of the things I do want to add to what John has mentioned, listeners, to your point is that, is it safe? So here's what I'll tell you, like the team of scientists that have worked the nights away, people who have invested their time and effort, they're there to ensure that it is safe. And given the data that was provided during clinical trials, so what has been shared is it does seem that vaccine is safe. So another question that has come up is, do you feel this is going to turn into a flu situation where they will be vaccinating people every year because there's a new strain out there?
My own suspicion is that it's not. It's going to be a little bit controversial because people are worried, but there have been a lot of false analogies with coronavirus and influenza, which are very different. And there are different pressures, particularly in the case of influenza, with the avian strain mixing with the pig strains, mixing with the human strains, which have resulted in significant mutations and the need for new immunizations every year. While there have been some mutations, and there's one which is getting a lot of press right now, which has come out of the United Kingdom and another in South Africa, they've made the virus more transmissible. In other words, it means that, it's easier to transmit it to other people, but they haven't associated these particular mutations with increased virulence, which means that they're more harmful to you. So my guess is that you probably won't, although there may be some people suggesting as we go forward that people get booster exams or a new immunization every year, but that really hasn't been justified scientifically yet. And so it remains to be seen. And my guess, based on the biology of previous viruses that are similar to this, is that once you've either had the infection or you've been immunized, you're probably pretty safe. And probably there have been very few cases of people getting it a second time after they've had it the first time. And I find it probably pretty unlikely that you'll need another vaccine after you get the first series. The two that are first out there now, the ones from Pfizer and the ones from Moderna, require 2 immunizations. And it's actually very important because that's how they were studied to get both of them. And one of the controversies now is people are saying, well, rather than getting the second one, we should distribute all of the vaccine to as many people as possible. But I can understand from a public health point of view why some people might advocate that, but there isn't really the science to back that up, suggesting that there would be no problems with people either not getting the second half of their vaccine regimen or having a delay with it. So it's potentially dangerous. They're hoping that a lot of the manufacturers are going to be able to ramp up the manufacturing so that as we kind of run out of the vaccine for the first round, that there'll be enough coming online quickly enough so that people can get the second vaccination on schedule. And some of the new vaccines that are coming out only require one shot. And so that'll be nice too, because then you won't have to worry about getting the second one either 3 or 4 weeks later.
Definitely great points. And one of the things that I really picked up, John, was that, that has not been proven yet. And wonderful listeners, there's one thing people say, oh, this was what was said. And then they said something else. They lied. So one of the things I want to share with you is that science is one of the few principles and one of the few disciplines that prides itself in sharing the most accurate information at a given time. And then if you find another information, the key is to update it rather than pushing it under the, pushing it behind the curtain or pushing it under the rug. So can you add a couple of things?
Yeah.
Because, it's possible that what we are sharing today may become something different tomorrow.
I agree with you completely. And the earlier thing that I alluded to about how we were screening drugs to see whether they worked in monkey kidney cells first is an example, whereas now there was a consensus meeting that the National Institutes of Health had right after the election, where all the experts have recognized that probably the thing to do would be testing these particular types of drugs in human lung cells because it's a human lung disease. So that's an example where as time goes on, there's a scientific consensus on better approaches. And there may be an additional consensus down the road that a 1 vaccine regimen is better than a 2 vaccine regimen. And another example of that, I think, relates to masks, which have been somewhat controversial, where initially in the pandemic, there was a concern that we would run out of them, and people were advocating that only healthcare professionals wear masks. And that, of course, has changed, where they're suggesting that the broad population wear them. And there's a lot of controversy there, too, about the type of mask. Obviously, the ones like the N95 mask, which, are less porous and exclude the virus better, are going to be more effective in protecting people and preventing the spread of the virus than, let's say, like a simple surgical mask or a cloth mask. But I think what you'll find out is that as more studies are done with different types of masks and so on, they'll refine the thinking about what's the safest thing to do from infection control. And we've seen similar types of things also going on with the diagnostics and which type of diagnostic test to use and when and so on. So I agree with you completely that we build on the knowledge that we get. And a lot of this in this particular pandemic is unusual because people have been publishing information and these new types of media called preprint journals that are not peer reviewed. But as science catches up and larger number of people review articles that are submitted to journals, the quality of our understanding of the issues will become better and better, so that going forward we'll have a better approach. And we're constantly learning more about this particular virus.
Great points, John. So another question that has come through is, do you not think the best way is to let the body build the antibodies it needs naturally?
Well, the way that happens is when you get infected with the virus. So I don't think that's the best way to go, because some of the people who become infected with the virus, a lot of them won't be that adversely impacted, but there's going to be a subset of people, if you just let the virus take its course, who are going to have a number of problems. Some will be immediate or acute, where you might end up in the hospital and on a respirator and have a bad outcome that way. And others might be longer term. There's a group of people they're calling long haulers now, who are exhibiting continuous symptoms from having had the virus, or potentially, and this includes even younger people, there's damage to these very tiny blood vessels that could cause the equivalent of mini strokes. It could also cause potentially diseases like Alzheimer's or Parkinson's to occur earlier because of accelerated degeneration of some of the nerve cells. And we don't really know what all the long-term effects are going to be. So when people have suggested to me that people have, let's say, COVID parties to get it over with, I think that's a terrible idea, because even for younger people who are protected, for the most part from dying outright, like some of the older people or people with comorbid medical conditions are, there are potential long-term consequences. And so I think the best thing to do is to have people immunized, and until everybody's immunized, to have some drugs that you can give to people immediately after they're infected to stop the progress of the disease right at the start, before a lot of damage is done.
Absolutely. And one of the things I want to kind of come back to, a statement from our listener, is when we were talking about the immunization, and we were talking that this is the data that we have. So response to that, it seems like trial and error on human test subjects. What would you respond to that?
Well, all drugs, in order to get approved, have to go through clinical trials. And so all of those are, in fact, trials that are done on human test subjects. They work in having three phases. The first phase is just to look at general issues of safety. And then the second type of trials are to look at the effectiveness of the drug or the therapy, or the vaccine, for people with the actual disease. And then the third phase generally is on a much larger patient population, where you're potentially comparing something to a standard of care that's already been established, but you're also trying to have a large patient population so that adverse effects that maybe affect a small percentage of people will come to light, and you might come up with some sort of guidance on better and more safely administering drugs to people. But that's sort of how the system works, where you initially do those trials, but then afterwards you do follow-up on people and collect information. They call that pharmacovigilance, so that if it turns out that there's a population where one works better than another, you can direct people to that one. Or if there's a population of people where something is not as safe as originally believed or anticipated, that changes can be made at that point as well.
Mm-hmm. And you said a lot of things that really resonated with me, is that it's trial and error and how everything is played out. And folks, one of the key things to remember is that informed decisions are being made, and these vaccines have not been put out there just lightly, that okay, that we need a vaccine, let's put it out there. There are tons and tons of data that scientists go through, and then it's released. So I just want to touch base upon one of the points that somebody had made, is that okay, let's have COVID parties, get herd immunity. So one of the things I want to share is that recently, I didn't even know, and I don't think so, this symptom is very widely known. So one of my friends over Christmas, they tested negative before getting on an airplane. And as they were getting on an airplane, my friend was going to see their parents. And after a couple of days after they landed, what happened was their 16-year-old son was having hallucinations and just could not keep himself under control, and a lot of things going on. Parents were so worried, they had to call 911. And he was tested from A to Z with all tests. And then one of the medical doctors recommended, why don't we test him for COVID? I mean, there was no reason for him to be tested because he had tested negative. When they tested, he was tested positive. And if somebody had told me this, I would not have believed it. And that, coming from my own friend who went through it, is really devastating, because we don't know what the long-term effects are. So folks, we are sharing information here with you, and the key is for you to make an informed decision. And just so that you know, I am not making any money on this show right now. So my whole goal is to just bring you pure information from John, who is coming from science background and working in it right now. So one another thing that I wanted to add about that young gentleman was that when COVID testing is performed within first or second day, the chances of COVID-19 coming back negative after the exposure are absolutely negative. So let's say you've been exposed to COVID-19 positive person. So first and second day, you'll test negative. So now we are finding out that the actual day of testing is between fifth and seventh day of your exposure. Just an information that I'm sharing. So going back to your original thing, that it's important to have two ways of dealing with pandemics like this. One is immunization and second is therapeutic. So can you talk a bit more about it? What infrastructure is needed and what maybe works for COVID-19?
Well, you made some outstanding points. People talk a little bit about an incubation period, and I personally don't like that word, but what they're saying is there's a time after you initially get exposed to the virus that the virus starts replicating and it builds up to a point where you can both detect it and you become symptomatic. And that's also the point that you can begin to transmit it to others, which is something which people are very concerned about in terms of asymptomatic transmission. And so the goal is to be able to give people a therapeutic who are positive, one, as quickly as possible, as soon as you reach that point where you can use diagnostics to find out that someone has it or the first symptoms are coming in. The challenge that we have now is that the products that the antiviral therapeutic products that have been approved, we've been learning over time that they don't work for as well or very well at all for people who've had the virus for a long time, but they work much better for people who've only had it for a short time before the virus is able to proliferate so much that you have a gigantic load of virus in you. And so the latest drugs, which have been made available through emergency use authorizations, are fancy products called monoclonal antibodies that are infused. And President Trump, for instance, had one of those treatments from Regeneron when he tested positive for the virus. The challenge with them is that you have to get to a place that has the ability to do intravenous infusion of very complicated and expensive drugs. One of the places that you can do that is the hospital, and there's some other places conceivably where it can be done, but it's kind of hard. And I think what's happened is that there's a consensus with the government now, with the people involved in infectious disease, that it would be much more desirable if people had something that you could take immediately upon diagnosis. So for instance, if you went to a drive-in testing station and they said, sorry, you're positive, you've just, started showing the first symptoms, for instance, and you go in and get tested, that they would be able to give you something right then and there that you could take at home for, let's say, a 3-day period, maybe either pills or some type of an inhaler where the medication would go directly to the lungs, and then you would be done. And you wouldn't give the virus a chance to continue to replicate to the point where it could do really bad things for you. So that's the goal now. So what we're trying to do in the interim is to take some of these fancy injectable products and figure out ways of getting them to people, particularly minority populations and lower socioeconomic groups that don't normally have the ability to get access to these types of things. But then the bigger thrust is to figure out ways of getting things like inhalers or simple tablets and outpatient types of drugs to people who test positive that would be really convenient and inexpensive, so that they'd be able to take them effectively, and it kind of wouldn't break the bank and wouldn't require traveling long distances to go to special facilities to get drugs infused. And so we're in the process of working as part of the government has an initiative called Beyond the Needle, a needle meaning that they don't want to have to go to a hospital and be in a hospital room getting an infusion for 4 hours for 5 days or 10 days, just to get something really simple. And at the same time, we're trying to solve the logistical problems with the vaccines. so that they can get distributed to more people so that we can end this pandemic as quickly as possible.
No, great points. So since we've been talking about vaccines, one of our listeners has another question, is that you don't know what's in those vaccines or how they will react in the bodies of people. How would you respond to that?
Well, the way that vaccines work is that you're usually taking little pieces of proteins that are associated with the virus, and you're using those sort of pieces. They call them antigens. It's a technical term. In order to induce a response of your immune system, so that when it sees that and recognizes it, that they'll basically start taking care of the infection. The things in the vaccines which make them more effective in traditional vaccines, there's certain very well-known substances that you can put into them called adjuvants, which make the body react more strongly to them. And then there are other vaccines, like the ones that are available now, that people are putting things into them that help preserve them, because these are the vaccines that are available now from Moderna and from Pfizer are called mRNA vaccines, which is a brand new technology. Some of the ones that Johnson & Johnson and the other companies are in the process of testing now are more traditional ones. But it's not like we know nothing about the other things that are put in there to enhance the effectiveness of the viruses. They've been studied for a long time and are tried and true. So it's really the only thing which is new is sort of the active part of the vaccines, which are a piece of this of the protein that forms a spike, which kind of like plunges into your cells, and they call that the spike protein. And so what they've done is that they're very similar. Is they've taken a little piece of that, and they've got a technology to have your body produce a little piece of that in your own cells, so that your immune system will recognize and it'll protect you. But the things that they're putting into the vaccines are very, very safe.
So you mentioned something very, very, how should I say, very poignant, in the sense that, in this current vaccine, we are not following the traditional route where we have the dead pieces of viruses. So just to kind of speak in layman's terms, but we're using mRNA technique. And a lot of people that I speak to will say, oh, you come from a pharmaceutical background. How is this virus safe? It's not similar to other vaccines. What would you say to that?
So the mRNA is really a blueprint for the little piece of protein. So you can take the little piece of protein in there, which is what you do traditionally, where you inactivate a virus or you chop little pieces up and you put it in there. And so what's new with this technology is that you're giving the people the blueprint, and then your own body, it helps produce those little pieces that then sees it. So the result is the same. It's just a little bit of how you get there, whether you're giving them the finished product or you're giving the blueprint for the finished product. But the result is essentially the same either way. And that's why you shouldn't really be all that concerned about it. It sounds like a scary name, but in fact, it's just a different way of doing the same thing. It's a little bit newer technology, and one that could be developed a little bit faster. One of the things that was lucky in a way, given that how technology is advanced, was that the sort of genetic blueprints or description of the virus were published almost at the beginning of the pandemic, back at this time last year, or even a little bit earlier, which enabled companies like Moderna to get started almost immediately on their vaccine. And that's truly miraculous that our technologies advanced to that point. Otherwise, it might have taken a lot longer to develop vaccines. And in the meantime, a number of other companies are using other new technologies as well as traditional approaches. So there are literally going to be dozens of vaccines that are available. And people might say, well, why do we need that many? We might not need that many in the United States, but there's as we're finding out now, there's still a limited capacity, although we're ramping it up to manufacture enough. And so the thinking is that by having more vaccines available, maybe there'll be additional ones if they all work pretty well, that you'll have a lot of companies manufacturing a lot of them, and we'll be able to kind of cover everybody, not only in our own country, but around the world as well.
Absolutely, and especially with globalization and thinking about greater good, it's important to immunize everyone. So this way we can get back to a new normal of new life where, yes, folks, we will be going back to a new normal, but it's never kind of going to be the same again because we still don't have data that, if you're immunized, whether you'll be transmitting the virus or not. We know that you'll be protected, but we don't know about transmission. So currently, the key is to kind of get back into that groove where people can start living their lives back up again, maybe with a little bit of caution, but it's worth it. So a few more questions came in is, what if the antigens turn on the body itself?
Sorry, what if the what?
What if the antigens? Yeah. What if the antigens turn on the body?
Well, I don't think that they really can turn on the body. I mean, one concern and sort of question with this virus is that some people are very sensitive to the antigens in this virus and have a huge immunological response. In fact, almost like an autoimmune disease, too much. And then other people, it's very minor. And so that's why you see a lot of people, the vast majority of people who get infected with the virus have little or no major acute problems. There might be some in some cases, some long-term things that we don't really know about too much yet. But it's kind of similar to what we found when we were trying to cure the common cold, which is also caused by coronaviruses and some similar ones called picornaviruses. And it turns out with the cold that the viruses themselves actually don't do much damage. But the reason that you get the runny nose and the headaches and the congestion is your own immune system's response to the virus, and you sort of overreact. And so one of the things that happens is that when you shut down the replication of the virus, you need to do it very quickly, because otherwise the horse is out of the barn, and you can still overreact if your body's been exposed to it. And so one of the research areas that people were concerned about with COVID-19 is trying to understand why is it that some people have their bodies way overreact and end up in the hospital and end up having to go on respirators, whereas other people, you might have a scratchy throat for a couple of days and that's it. Because we're hoping that the insight in terms of what the differences are between people, and we know that one of the factors are comorbid or other medical conditions people have, like diabetes and being overweight and things of that nature, can cause things to be worse. But there are other factors which haven't been figured out completely yet that we're trying to get at. One of them is, why is it that it affects older people much worse than younger people? A scary thing about the 1918 flu pandemic is that it was wiping out 18 to 20-year-olds, just like it was with older people. Sometimes the people would be dead within 48 hours. That's not the case with COVID-19. It tends to have much worse effects on older people and slightly worse ones on men than in women. And so people are trying to understand, and we've got some theories, and I've been working on that too, as to why it is that babies and children tend to be more protected, and why it is that you're at greater risk the older you are, with sometimes nursing home patients being the ones most at risk. And so the thinking is that if we can figure out, what causes our own immune system to react so strongly in some people rather than others, that'll give us some new approaches, both in terms of prioritization for the immunization, but also figuring out better ways of using therapeutics One of the ones, by the way, which has been most effective in people who've actually developed the disease is a drug called dexamethasone, which is a steroid immunosuppressant. So it calms down the immune system. And so we're going to continue to try and work on better strategies to help protect people.
We have a couple of other questions. So one is, tell us about the drugs your company is trying to develop, and we'll go back to our other listeners' questions as well.
Sure. So one of the things that we're doing is we're taking older drugs, and they call this a repurposing strategy, that have shown effectiveness in human lung cell models of this disease, and figuring out ways of getting them to people easier and quicker, which would include taking them in a respiratory delivery system. In other words, like a portable inhaler, so that you inhale the drugs in a gas form, and can do that for maybe a half an hour a day for 3 or 4 days and be done with the virus. Similarly, I'm also working on a tablet formulation where you can take a couple of pills for a few days and you'll be done, rather than having to take long infusions of drugs intravenously that would require you to be in the hospital. And so far, there's nothing, believe it or not, there's nothing out there that's easy and convenient for people to take as an outpatient. And the government has realized that this should be a big priority. The other reason, and it's something that I worry about, is that COVID-19 is not the only respiratory virus that's out there that can cause a pandemic. Besides this and the flu, there are a number of other ones, both viral pathogens, and there are also some bacterial pathogens as well. And so we need to set up an infrastructure in our country so that if one of these pandemics starts to emerge, that not only can we go on a crash program to develop vaccines, which is what we've done, but in the meantime, to keep 300,000 or 400,000 or even millions of people from passing away while the vaccines are being developed, that we would have some drugs available off the shelf, which could essentially stop the progress of the virus at the very beginning, and also set up our clinical trial infrastructure so that you could work to get things to people almost at the place where they're tested, which we're not really set up to do right now. Clinical trials, you have to go somewhere. For instance, for the Pfizer vaccine, the initial trials, I'm in New Jersey. The closest sites were in Buffalo, New York, which is 5 or 6 hours away. So it's hard to get clinical trials completed and to get readouts on the safety and effectiveness of drugs if you have to have people who are getting the viruses or whatever traveling hundreds of miles and spending hours in hotel stays and so on to enroll in the clinical trials. So we need a better way of screening existing products that potentially could help. And I'm working on with some groups to try and do that. And then we also need to improve our system, our clinical trial system for testing drugs, to make it much quicker and more convenient to do that, so that the trial comes to the person with the problem rather than the person with the problem having to find a clinical trial site somewhere around the country and participate that way.
Mm-hmm. Some great information. And we are nearing to the end of our show. And folks, I know you are sharing so many of the questions. So one of the things I will just kind of share is that, look, don't miss out the forest for the trees, and don't miss out the trees for the forest. So when you're thinking about why things are being blown or what is happening, look beyond just the immediate data that you have. Look beyond and see who's involved and what's happening. And I'd like to take a moment and recognize all of our frontline workers, especially our healthcare workers who have been there in and out for a year. And we feel that we are tired, and think about those people who have been at it and serving and supporting us for so long. So thank you, John. And if somebody were to reach out to you and get more information, what's the best way of connecting with you?
My company has a website. It's www.BalinBac, BalinBac.com. It talks about what we're doing, and there's also a mechanism to get in touch with me and members of our team, and we'd be happy to get back to you to answer any questions we can.
Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you were to leave us with one thought, because as you saw, there's so many different questions even still pouring in, why COVID-19 has been blown out of proportion, why should we trust someone or government or Pfizer companies or Moderna or any of the pharmaceutical companies, because people may be thinking they're making money. So given all this distrust and all that, as a parting thought, what would you tell our audience?
I've been involved in researching coronavirus for a long time, and the thing that we found is that getting treated as quickly as possible is key to the best outcomes. So I would do some work, maybe look at clinicaltrials.gov and so on, and be prepared so that I would get the vaccine as quickly as possible. But in the interim, while a lot of people are waiting, if you happen to be unlucky enough to get the virus, to see how you can get access to the either the currently available drugs, which are the monoclonal antibodies, or get enrolled in one of the clinical trials for the new convenient therapeutics, and do that almost immediately, because the longer you wait, the more dangerous it is. So I think my piece of advice, which may be different from other people's, which is sort of plan a little bit and then act fast.
Absolutely. And you said that, folks. And here's the thing, we do not know what are the long-term effects. So given that, John, very sound advice, and thank you for sharing information. And folks, we brought you completely unedited and live information, so you can go and make your informed decisions. We are neither for one side or the other side. Either way, this is just an effort to bring you information. And thank you for being engaged. Thank you, John, for sharing.
Thank you, Divya.
And thank you, listeners, for such wonderful engagement. Really appreciate it. And last but not the least, thank you, Rebel, for making the show possible. Until next time, be well and take care.
Thank you for being part of Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. We hope you have learned more about how to start living the life you want. Each week on Beyond Confidence, you hear stories of real people who have experienced growth by overcoming their fears and building meaningful relationships. During Beyond Confidence, Divya Parekh shares what happened to her when she stepped out of her comfort zone to work directly with people across the globe. She not only coaches people how to form heart connections, but also transform relationships to mutually beneficial partnerships as they strive to live the life they want. If you are ready to live the life you want and leverage your strengths, learn more at www.divyaparekh.com. And you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. We look forward to you joining us next week, Monday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time.